Okay, for this lecture, we're going to be talking about flow states. The flow state is a term of art that comes into use in the 1960s from this researcher, psychologist, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who was friends with a bunch of artists and notices a strange behavior that these artists are engaging in, which is that they would become so obsessed and absorbed in the work of art that they were painting, they would forget to eat, and they would ignore the world around them, and they would just be so absolutely committed to the activity that they were doing. And then when the painting was complete, they would set it aside and completely ignore it, besides trying to sell it perhaps, but it wouldn't have the same power of absorption and grabbing that it did while the process was ongoing. They would just move on to a new painting. So what's going on with this really peculiar behavior? Well, what Csikszentmihalyi notices is that there's motivation in the moment. It seems like the activity of painting that particular painting in that particular moment is motivating and provides energy for the sustained attention to the complexity and articulation of the process of the activity. There's also different kinds of motivation between moments. So the motivation that is had in the process of the action of painting, of being in the zone or in the flow, looks different than the kind of motivation in between paintings where the artist would lose interest or the same kind of interest in the work after it was complete and would be seeking motivation or inspiration to get reabsorbed in the next painting. So Csikszentmihalyi begins interviewing these artists. And what Csikszentmihalyi finds is that there's certain phenomenological motifs to the data that he collects from the phenomenological reports of these artists. And these same motifs would later be reproduced in work by Nakamura and others, in rock climbers, in motorcyclists, in factory workers, and all over the place. So these motifs include an intense and focused concentration on one's activity in the present moment, a merging of action and awareness, where it feels like all of our attention is absorbed into the fine-grained details and the sort of holistic sense of what we're doing as we're doing it, and the limit of attention is the limit of action. There's a loss often of self-reflective consciousness where we're not thinking, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that, but rather there's a fluid flexibility to the doing and the process of doing as it is occurring. There's also a sense that one is in control of one's actions, and that regardless of what might come, they would know what to do. So there's a certain sort of flexibility and responsiveness to complexity and novel challenges, and a certain sort of confidence that it's possible to overcome these challenges. Oftentimes there's a distortion of time, which can look like a shrinking of time or an expansion of time. So you can be in the flow state for a couple hours and then it feels like seconds and you're out, or it can feel like time slows down so that you have the time to work through what is going on so you can perform really fast actions in really deliberate sorts of ways. Likewise, there's a sense of experiencing intrinsic reward for the process of the activity. So doing is not just about the extrinsic success or meeting the goal or achieving some end that you set out to achieve at the beginning of the act. Rather, it's the process of performance itself that seems to feed into the reward structure of the continued performance of the action. So as the artist would get absorbed in their painting, it seems that the process of painting is rewarding and perhaps even more rewarding than having a complete painting at the end of the process. So how does the flow happen? Well, this is an early chart. There are newer charts out there, but this one's really nice because it's quite instructive for where flow happens. So flow happens, as Mihai Csikszentmihalyi tells us, between boredom and anxiety, where performing an activity happens on a spectrum of skill to challenge, and if the challenge of an act outstrips the skill that you have to perform that act, then you'll be anxious. Oh no, I can't do this. However, if your skill outstrips the challenge of the present performance, then you'll be bored. This is this is easy, or this doesn't challenge me, right? Flow is what happens when challenge perfectly meets skill. And you'll notice that you don't need to be an expert in order to get into the zone. You just need to have challenges that meet your level of skill. So novices as well as experts and intermediates, everybody along the way can get into the zone. And similarly, flow isn't just a phenomenological quality of the way in which we perform, it's also something that helps us to develop ourselves. And when we act in the world and get into the zone, we work in such a way as to be challenged and to overcome those challenges. And then we recognize that in overcoming those challenges, we're the sorts of people that can do so. So there's a sense of growth of self in this. There's also a sense of growth of self in that people who tend to get into the flow tend to develop in themselves what Csikszentmihalyi calls the autotelic personality. It's a trait of character, which means that auto of its own and telic refers to the end or goal oriented. So the idea here is that an autotelic person is a person who's intrinsically motivated to engage in activities, or a person who generally enjoys doing things for their own sake rather than for some external goal. And so these autotelic people are people who have a sort of character to seek out challenges for the sake of being challenged, because that's what gets them in the zone. And the more that you get in the flow, the more likely you are to develop this kind of character trait, says Csikszentmihalyi, and the more likely you are to have a proclivity for engaging in flow activities. So autotelic persons are typically more active and receptive to new experiences, they're curious, and they're open to challenges and ready to engage them. So being autotelic helps one to enter into flow states more reliably, but also entering flow states also tends to produce autotelic characteristics in people over time. So there you go. That's flow. That's being in the zone. This is a very brief introduction to the phenomenon. Hopefully it was interesting to you, and I hope that you seek out your own challenges and to develop in yourself your own sense of an autotelic personality to get in the zone and do what you do even better.